Welcome everyone to week 4 of our lecture series, Rippling Effects of the Great Famine. Tonight, this lecture series tonight has been organised by Council's Good Relations Programme, which is part financed by the Executive Office of Northern Ireland. I'd like to make everyone aware that the lectures delivered throughout this series are the interpretations and opinions of the individual guest speakers from the research they've carried out in their individual field, and not that of Armagh City Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council. The objective of this series is to give a brief insight into the rippling effects of the Great Famine, which will develop a greater understanding of this period in our history and encourage conversation. Tonight, joining us as always is Dr. Gerard McAtasney, Lurgan historian and author. Gerard's books include The Dead Buried by the Dying, The Great Famine in Leitrim, published in 2014, The Other Famine, the 1822 Crisis in County Leitrim, published in 2010, and also Gerard has contributed to the Atlas of the Great Irish Famine, published in 2012. He was also co-author of The Hidden Famine, Poverty, Hunger and Sectarianism in Belfast, published in 2000. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Colm Donnelly from Queen's University Belfast. The title for Colm's talk tonight is Famine Roads, Archaeological Insights into the Public Work Schemes from the Great Famine in Ireland. Colm is an historical archaeologist in the School of Natural and Built Environment and co-director with Professor Eileen Murphy of the Centre for Human Archaeology, with research interests in medieval and 17th century Irish buildings, Gaelic Medieval Ulster, children's burial grounds and community archaeology. An experienced field archaeologist, in 2021, he led a community-based archaeological excavation of a Famine Road in County Fermanagh with Professor Murphy. Colm has also led a transatlantic excavation and education programme between the University of Massachusetts Lowell and Queen's University Belfast. Colm, if you'd like to commence your presentation and share it with us, please.
I will try and share my screen. Is that working?
Yes, it is. I think though you should probably if you can just bring up each main slide at a time, as currently, yes. Yep. Currently, if you can set up the slideshow.
Yeah.
So we just see each individual slide. Currently, we see all future slides too.
Oh, well, I changed it there, and all my screen is just basically the slide, the first slide, the title slide. So I don't have them on my screen.
Just bear with me, please. That's unusual. If you'd like to go ahead now, Colm.
Will do. Okay, Dolores, thank you very much, and thank you to Gerard for that very kind introduction. I think there's two things to say before I begin going into the lecture in detail. The first is that it's a lecture by myself, and it's also Eileen Murphy. And as Dolores mentioned, Eileen and myself undertook the excavation at Famine Road in Fermanagh, and it's been very much a joint project. Why is a joint project so much over the years? If you look at our bibliographies, you'll see there's a lot of Colm Donnelly and Eileen Murphy publications. That's because we're married, and we have been married for the last 25 years. So this is one of our projects, like our children's burial grounds, that we do together. And it was a project we both really wanted to do. And we did it under the auspices of our Centre for Community Archaeology. The other thing is, as we go through this lecture, I'm very conscious that I am a historical archaeologist, but I'm also primarily an archaeologist. And I'm sure there are people who are watching this presentation tonight who know an awful lot more about the famine. So there's background information, and it may be very, very simplistic, but bear with me, because I'm putting in that background information to give a context to the work that we did and how it came along, how it happened. So the key point, I suppose, is in 2020, that was down as the 175th anniversary of the Great Famine. And I and myself were of a view that we should be doing something to commemorate this. If you think of the impact that the famine had on our island, you have the census from 1841 and from 1851, and you see this reduction, near 20% reduction in the number of people on the island. And the island really hasn't recovered from that, from population point of view. We're still recovering from the fact that we lost so many people at that time due to death, migration, and then as the 19th century continued, more people leaving through emigration, and also a reluctance to marry young and to have children. It had a very big impact on us. And we've seen since certainly the 150th anniversary more awareness of the famine and the memorials. So you've got the Liffey Memorial there. You also have the Cornagrade Memorial at Enniskillen and the graveyard there that was used by the workhouse in Enniskillen. You have also the buildings themselves associated with the workhouses, such as Lisnaskea, but also dotted across the countryside, you have buildings which were abandoned either at the time of the famine or were abandoned by people emigrating and leaving the land in the 19th century. And each one of these has now become an archaeological site and worthy of study. So we were conscious of that whenever we were trying to frame a project to undertake the commemoration. One of the projects that we came up with was in working with the Glens of Antrim potatoes, because the McKillop family, who run the Glens of Antrim potatoes, they obtained historic seed potatoes, lumper potatoes in Scotland, and they brought them back, and they have actually now got lumper potatoes back as a brand that you can buy, and you can see what these potatoes were like, these lumper potatoes, which were almost extinct. But these are the famous potatoes from the famine. And one of the things that the Glens of Antrim do, they take the potatoes and they give them out to schools, so the schools can actually grow lumper potatoes. And we thought this would be really good. We'd do something similar with our students. We'd plant the potatoes and we'll then harvest them, and then we'll have some sort of a meal, commemorative meal about the famine. And the heart of this story is the potato. I mean, the potato it's a key element of the rural economy in the 19th century. And you do get, again, there's an archaeological signature associated with this cultivation. No ploughs were used by and large in the marginal lands to create the furrows for the growth of the potatoes. You had cultivation rigs commonly known as lazy beds. It was all manual work carried out by spade and shovel, and in some places the loy. Suffice to say, it was not lazy, but it enabled in marginal lands to be used productively. And there is a thing to remember about the lazy beds. If you're driving through the countryside and you see that corrugated field, the corrugated lines in that field as you're driving up, up the side of a mountain, it probably means that the last crop in that field either rotted or was never harvested. Because whenever you're harvesting the potatoes out of a lazy bed, out of those cultivation rigs, you actually pretty much have to destroy the rig to actually get all the potatoes out. So if the rigs are sitting on the landscape and they haven't actually, they're still there may be a very good reason why they're still there. There's a population increase that's occurring across Europe in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, and Ireland is part of that population change. Rising population levels in Ireland aren't unique. But what's unique for us is the fact that we have a very rural society. We have very limited industrial activity. It's subsistence economy. There's pressure on the land and the tillage, and the peasantry have got their small holdings, and generation upon generation, they're dividing and subdividing their small holdings right the way down to the size of about a quarter of an acre. And the reason why they're able to do this was because of the potato crop, because it is a really nutritious food source. I remember looking at data some time ago of the British Army and the stature of the British Army in the 19th century. Whenever recruits were being brought into the army, their height was taken. And what you found was that recruits from Ireland were about 2 inches taller than recruits from England. And that was being put down to the fact that the Irish had a diet with potatoes and buttermilk, which was really, really nutritious. Whereas the English, particularly in urban settings, the English diet was tea and bread. So the potato is a fantastic food, and that's what allows the population to increase. As long as you've got your crop, and as long as you're able to then pay your rent on your plot of land, everything's well. Other food was being grown in Ireland, but it was being exported to feed England's industrial cities and other parts of the empire. What's quite amazing is the fact that, you've got a population of about 8 million people, and half of that population are the cottiers. These are the people that we're talking about here, the peasantry who are living on these small holdings, and they have these small cabins that they're living in, very poor quality. And all the way through the late 18th century, we're in the age of improvement. In the late 18th century, you're getting these accounts from visitors who are saying that the conditions of the majority of the poorer levels of society in Ireland, it's appalling, and the housing is appalling, and the landlords don't really care. And some of the landlords did care, and some of the landlords did try to bring in improvements, but by and large, the lot of the people was very low. What happens in 1854 is the collapse of the potato crop because of this fungal infection blight, and the crop rots in the ground. And if it had been 1 year, that would probably have been bad, but they would have got over it. It's because it happens in successive years that the cottiers lose their primary food source. And the people who are most badly affected by the effects of the blight are those people, the cottier class in society. What money they had was needed to pay for other foods. This meant that they couldn't pay their rent. This meant that the landlords were not pleased. The result, you had a catastrophic situation, which you have a famine, but you also then in turn it leads to evictions. And if we look at the, archaeology, where's archaeology's position in all of this? Back in the 1996, there was a book published, Fearful Realities, and it was at that time, around the 150th anniversary, when there were a whole series of books being written, very much from the historical point of view, using the historical sources. But in amongst them was this Fearful Realities book, New Perspectives. And one of the perspectives was a chapter written by Charles E. Orser, better known as Chuck Orser. And Chuck wrote this article, Can There Be an Archaeology of the Great Famine? And as far as I'm aware, it's the only article at that time which actually introduced the word archaeology to the subject. Now, Chuck was really well positioned to ask these questions because he is a highly respected American academic. He's a historical archaeologist. He's the guy that wrote the textbook Historical Archaeology, first published in 1995. The third edition is now out, 2016. And what Chuck would say is that the archaeological fieldwork methodology that we use can be applied to any site, anywhere, of any period in time. And it's all about generating new information and interpretations of what happened in the past based on what we find through our studies. And the key with historical archaeology is we integrate that archaeological fieldwork methodology with other sources of information, such as cartographic sources, historical documents, newspaper accounts, upstanding architecture. And we've been doing this work in Queens in the CCA. One project that I'm particularly enjoyed doing was Retreat Castle. Retreat Castle we excavated in 2016. The reason we excavated it was a local landscape partnership scheme, Heart of the Glens Landscape Partnership Scheme, funded by the Lottery Fund. They had been looking for a site for a community excavation. And up in the glens above Cushendall, there's this ruin called Retreat Castle. Is it a castle? Nobody knows. Nobody knew. Nobody really knew what this thing was. What we did was we combined the cartographic evidence, geophysical survey evidence, excavated evidence, upstanding architectural elements, and bringing that all together, what we demonstrated was that this was not a castle in the sense of an Anglo-Norman fortification. This was a country house, and it had been built there by a guy, Captain George Ewing, in 1775, and it was tied in to what I mentioned there just a minute ago, the whole notion of improvement. This is a guy who came from Dublin with his wife and wanted to have an improved farm up in the top of a mountain in the Glens. And you do have to wonder about his wit, because the Glens of Antrim and the top of a mountain are not the best place to be starting trying to do grain farming. He invested money in this. He invested heavily in building a really nice country house. And you can see here from the remains, the upstanding remains, and from the excavated trenches where we picked up the foundations, we were able to build a picture of what the ground floor plan of this house actually looked like. And it's similar to a building still upstanding, Grace Hill in North Antrim would be a similar parallel to what was being built here. And then the money ran out and it was abandoned. And it was used as a sort of like a house for the stock keepers looking after the sheep for the Boyd landlords. And then it was abandoned by 1800. So we can use that methodology, our fieldwork methodology, on sites that are quite recent. Also, First World War practice trenches. One of my colleagues, Heather Montgomery, Heather did her PhD on looking at the archaeology of the First World War practice trenches at places like McGilligan and at Ballykindler. And using the archaeological evidence to see just how well the Irish soldiers were trained before they went off to the Western Front. Because there was this question mark over the training. You got generals and majors in the British Army giving out about the quality of the Irish and the quality of their training. What Heather's work demonstrated was that actually everything that you would get in the manual that would be expected for troops to be taught was being taught at places like Ballykindler and McGilligan. So that's what historical archaeology basically is, and that's what we do. That's what I am. I'm a historical archaeologist. And Chuck, he put this into action. He'd written his article, Can There Be an Archaeology of the Famine? Well, he then actually acted on this, and he went out to Ballykilclin on the Strokestown estate in Roscommon, and he undertook 5 seasons of excavation with his American crew, who would come across every summer, and they excavated a series of cottages on the estate. And these were cottages associated with evictions of the tenants in 1848 by their landlord, Machin. Excavating the houses and looking at the material culture that was found in those houses and what those material cultures can tell us about, big green streak has come across my screen. What that material culture can tell us about what life was like for the people living there before the houses are demolished. Results published in a series of academic papers and also in a book, Unearthing Hidden Ireland, published in 2006. Now, since that time, there's been some other additional work that's been undertaken. Sometimes it's tied in to development work. And so whenever the National Roads Authority were doing their new road scheme in County Meath in 2004, and they were doing the archaeological mitigation in advance of that, they came across this cottier's cabin, the foundations of a cottier's cabin. And again, because the remit of the National Roads Authority archaeologists and their contractors was that everything on the route of the road was to be studied, they excavated this cottier's cabin. It's pretty rough. The main big excavation, however, that has taken place in recent years, and this was undertaken by a commercial company in Kilkenny on land that had been owned by the Kilkenny Workhouse in 2005, 2006. And one of the guys that was on the excavation was Johnny Gebber. And Johnny was there when all of these skeletons, about 970 individuals, revealed in 63 mass burials, were found. He was involved in the excavation. And he went to Eileen, he came to Eileen. Eileen's a human osteoarchaeologist, and this was done as a PhD. He studied these skeletons as a PhD, and that has been published as a book, Victims of Ireland's Great Famine. And it's pure historical archaeology. You've got the osteo evidence, but you're matching it up with the archive research. And what that showed was that these pits, these mass burials, had been cut over a 43-month period, commencing in 1847. 2/3 of the children were under the age of 6. There was 545 skeletons for children. So you're looking at basically half the population, 2/3 were under the age of 6. So you're seeing that the death rate is really high among children in the workhouse. And we know from the historical sources that there's chronic overcrowding, infectious diseases are running rampant, and it's evident that you've got this terrible toll hitting these people who are in the workhouses. So much so that the council in Kilkenny, they actually ban the burial of paupers' burials in the town. And the workhouse has to deal with the situation that people are still dying. So the solution is that on their land, they start to open up these graves. And they start in the northeast corner of their property. And literally what happens is every week, one of these pits is dug and they bury people in it, and then they close it up. So the minute books suggest that, each of these burials represents the number of people who died in a week. And from that, you can then chart how many people died in a week from the physical remains in the ground. Johnny's book is very much sets the scene, the historical scene, but he then goes into the health status of the people who died. So we're getting right to the very heart of the famine. How did this impact on people? How did it impact their health? How did it kill them? There's another interesting aspect. Now, peppered through this tonight, there are slides which show Eileen. So she does exist. This is one of them. One of the things that we're interested in is also the material culture of the Great Famine. Now, we're interested in the material culture of the famine period, but probably the greatest aspect of material culture associated with the Great Famine, famine pots, these cauldrons, these cast iron cauldrons that we have that were used in workhouses, that were used in soup kitchens, that were brought in from the foundries in England, distributed around the country, and used in the soup kitchens. And there's a whole plethora of them still in Ireland. Some of them are forgotten about and in far off places in the sides of fields. Some of them have been recognized for what they are, and they're put in very nice locations, maybe at a workhouse or a museum or a church. But more work needs to be done on these, because nobody has actually, if you think of a classical prehistoric archaeologist, what would they do? They would classify these artifacts and they would try and put them into their typologies, and they would look at the size, they would look at the manufacture, they'd look at the materials used. None of that has been done for the famine pots. So that's a project that we have that we're looking at, and we're thinking about how can we possibly do this? How would we actually go about charting these in the first place and then getting them studied and analysed, and maybe it's the sort of thing that could be done as a PhD. Now, that then brings us on to another aspect of the famine, and that is the famine roads, the public relief schemes. Some of these are really well known. The Healy Pass is always the one that's referred to, this road that's on the Cork-Kerry border, that was developed as a public relief scheme during the famine years. And you can sort of see in these two images lifted from the Ordnance Survey Ireland, you can see the first edition map from before the famine, and you can see that the road rides up across the Cork landscape up to the border with Kerry, and there where the red dot is, it stops, and there's no road on the other side of the border. And then you can see the aerial view of today, and you can see from the red dot onwards, you can see that the road has been constructed during the famine period. Now, the first introduction I had to this concept of famine roads was by a guy, Gaby Burns, and it was around about the time of the 150th commemoration. Gaby works down in Fermanagh, lives down in Fermanagh, and he was contributing to a volume of local history that was being done by the Belcoo and District Development Group, entitled If Only. The idea being from the title that if only we had recorded this, if only we'd talked to people before they died, if only. And what he did was he presented this little chapter which was all about the famine roads in the Belcoo area. And I had never heard about these famine roads until Gaby's work. But at the heart of what he was doing are maps. The first edition Ordnance Survey maps from the 1830s, the second edition Ordnance Survey maps from the late 1850s, early 1860s. And you can see here, this is the Belcoo area in around 1860. And you've got the map sheet, a section of it. You have the road scheme, and that road scheme is pretty much the same as the road scheme as it was in the first edition. But you can see where I have put the blue arrows there, that there is sketched in the pathway of an uncompleted road. And if you go out to Belcoo and you go out to the field where that arrow is, you can see that there's this upraised flat area, which is the Famine Road. So that intrigued us, and it was the sort of thing that we thought to ourselves when we came to this commemoration. Why don't we do something that looks at the Famine Roads? Because this, to us, this is a physical manifestation of a specific period in time and the government reaction to what's happening in Ireland. Because the public works schemes, they're introduced by the British government as a response to the crisis in the autumn of 1846. And they focus on roads, and it's a means whereby the poor can obtain payment or food in return for work. You couldn't just possibly give people food. You couldn't set up food kitchens, soup kitchens, couldn't have that. They have to work for it. Then only if you give them the food, they'd just be coming back for more. Make them work for it. And it is this attitude of, they need to be deserving of assistance. Now, these roads, they take on a number of names, local names. Some of them are called the Meal Roads, the Broad Roads, the Bracken Roads, cuttings, lines, new lines. Now, at this stage, we are biased. We're very biased because Eileen is from Fermanagh and she's from Donnelly, and we decide that we're going to concentrate our efforts in Fermanagh. And we do the historical research, and we know that the roads are built between October 1846 and June 1847 in Fermanagh. And it's a really, really bad winter. It's a terrible winter. By spring 1847, there is a recognition, finally, from the British government that actually this is a disaster. This is not a good idea at all. And they do what they should have done in the first place, which was to set up soup kitchens funded by local taxation. And those roads that had been started, many of them weren't completed, such as the one we just seen at Belcoo, and many of them were abandoned unfinished. But you can see here from November 1846, the Victorians were great at recording, fantastic recording. And you can see here the Board of Works, the tallies of the numbers of people, 150,000 people in November 1846 across the island of Ireland who are involved in either drainage schemes or in road schemes, earning some sort of support to get them through these hard times. And you've got to have your rules and regulations. And you do get your rules and regulations of how this is all to be done. The bureaucracy kicks in, and you have all of this information in government papers. It's accessible. If you want an easier insight into what is happening, there's a very, very informative book written by a guy called William Henry Smith. And it's basically part memorial of his time in Ireland, part his views on how Ireland could be improved. But it's published in 1848 after he has returned from service in Ireland as a conducting engineer on the public works schemes. And he was a civil engineer. I think he's Anglo-Irish. It's hard to entirely work out what by birth an Irishman and in parentage and descent English actually means, but I presume there's some is Anglo-Irish. But his book gives you great insight into how the public works were organized and functioned, because you have sections there that go through each of the class of people who are employed on the scheme. You're moving away from the dull, dry government papers, and he tells you what the duties of the inspecting officers are, and then he gives you his own remarks on how they went about their work, how they could have done it better, what things they did well, what things they did bad. So it is actually a fascinating document written by a contemporary who was involved actually in the public works schemes. And this instruction that is given to the surveyors and the engineers, this continues from government into the actual types of implements that are to be purchased, the number that are to be purchased, and the actual dimensions of the items that are to be purchased. And you have this charted, and you're told that, you know, for example, that's small here, and for me, my own eyes aren't so good. In the county of Fermanagh, there's going to be 1,000 wheelbarrows and 10 clay packs, quarry picks, 50 quarry picks. They're identifying what is going to be needed for all of these works all the way through the countryside, county by county, province by province. And that also extends to the roads themselves that are to be built, because you have these instructions to the engineers depicting two types of road, either 24-foot wide and with a footpath, or 21-foot wide with no footpath. Whether they've got a footpath or whether they've not got a footpath, they are to be flanked with drains, and the drains are to be 3.5 foot deep. And the surface of the road is to have a soling. The soling is to be of clay or sand. The road deck is to be put on top of this surface, and it's to be of broken stone. And then sand or gravel, blinding, is to be spread over the surface of the broken stone to fill in any gaps. So it's all been made straightforward for them to what they're supposed to do. These are the instructions that are coming out. This is to be uniform across the whole of the island. The first thing that we did was we commissioned Gillian Almond, another historical archaeologist who'd done work on her PhD, had been on mental asylums in Ireland. We got her to do a report for us for the CCA, and we picked two of the baronies in Fermanagh, Boho and Donnelly. And she went and gathered up the information, the historical information relating to the relief works in those two baronies. Now, she also gathered up the newspaper information. She looked at the government papers, and you start then to get an idea of what is happening in Fermanagh and the conditions on these road schemes. And it was harsh. The labourers were expected to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they had to work until 6 o'clock in the evening. This is in the middle of the winter. They had 1 hour for dinner. This was 6 days a week. A roll was to be called each morning at 6 a.m. and a quarter of a day's pay was deducted from anyone who was not present. If they didn't attend at 9 a.m., half a day's pay was deducted. Anyone who attended after that hour was turned away from the day for the day. A roll was then called at 6 p.m. to make sure everybody was still there. They hadn't slaved off home, and no payment was made to anyone who wasn't present at that final roll call. Now, in some cases, the labourers may have received some food in the morning and at the end of the day, but the wages, the official rate varied, but it was about 6 pence to 10 pence per day, which is fine in practice as long as food prices don't rise. Because if the food prices are rising, then that amount of money is not enough to feed a family. It's barely enough to actually feed one person. So it's not enough. People are working hard out in these schemes and they're still not earning enough to be able to actually feed themselves and their families. And the first official reported death, this isn't saying that there could have been earlier deaths on the road schemes, but the first official one is from the Enniskillen Chronicle. It's the 22nd of December, 1846. And it reports the discovery of a man called James Rolston in the Lotherstone area, Irvingstown, who was found dead in a field. And he had been at the works and he was making his way home. It was really, really snowing, bad night, and he was found dead in the field. So you do have to wonder about this whole notion of, you know, are they deliberately doing this? Are they deliberately making this as hard as possible on people? Very unfeeling, unchristian, you would almost say. But then whenever you look at some of the writings of Charles Trevelyan, you don't get that surprised at all that this is the mentality that you have in certain elements within the British government at the time. This is basically the Irish, it's their own fault. This is God sending them a lesson, teaching them a lesson. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. It's all their fault. Another aspect of the work that Gillian did was looking at the schemes in the two baronies. And she identified that there were 34 schemes in all, and they were numbered. There were 17 in each barony. And she was then able to go and basically using the same methodology that Gaby had used back in 1996 or 1999 for his book. She used the same methodology, and she went and she looked at the historical information relating to the presentations for support, and looked at what was there in the first edition map and then what was there in the second edition map. And she was able to identify 26 of the road schemes. C6 comes into its own. Let us bear in mind C6. So there you have the road schemes in southwest Fermanagh, 1846, 1847. Not all of them are new roads. Some of them are improvements. What she's done is she's listed them as they were in the presentations. So, you know, M1 is Mahraboy Scheme 1, M2 is Mahraboy Scheme 2. We come down to C6, which is Donnelly Scheme 6. And this is an abandoned stretch of road known locally in the civil parish of Boho as the Line. It runs for 1.38 miles through 5 townlands from Drumcurran through to Tubradden, through to Drumkirk Upper and to Drumboy. And this is what it looks like in the field today, or rather in 2019, when we were selecting the site for our project. It's a green agricultural field. There's a clear raised platform running across the field. Now, the schemes in Fermanagh were to commence on the 15th of October, 1846. And you have a request made for the presentation, the presentment sessions for £400. And it's to run between Cloughnane Bridge and the crossroads at Boho. Boho Crossroads, it's called today. At that time, it was Acres Crossroads, it was called. And it's next to Flush Bridge. You have a second request for an additional £150 on the 30th of March, 1847. And then you have another request for £350 on the 22nd of May, 1847. So we think that because this money was forthcoming in March and May, at a time whenever it's becoming obvious that the schemes are going to be coming to an end, we think that basically this road scheme continued right through to the end of this, the whole process, 19th of June, 1847, when all of the public works had been terminated in the county. So the overall expenditure on C6, the Line, in that period is £900.
Colm,
Yeah,
can I ask you, what would £900 equate to in today's money?
that's a cruel question.
Sure, listen, I have to ask you because I know everybody's thinking it right now. What, like, we know it's a lot of money, but trying to get our head around.
What you need to do is to go on to one of those currency, ancient historic currency web pages. I think the British Library used to run one, and type in £900 and which that was worth in 1848. And I'm sure there's 138 people listen here. One of you should do it. One of you could not knit on there.
Sure, I'm going to start doing it now myself. Answer your chatting.
That was a sneaky question.
Okay, sorry, apologies for interrupting. I should have waited to the end. I'll go on.
The point is that basically we were planning on having this, our potatoes, and then having the excavation at the line. And we're going to do this in 2020, 175th anniversary. COVID comes along and we have to stop all fieldwork projects until the pandemic lifts. By June 2021, things are improving and we're able to get back out into the field. And so we send out our good friend, Alistair Ruffle, who is a geographer, but also a geophysicist. And he's really big into using ground probing radar, ground penetrating radar. And we asked him, would he go out and do some radar lines for us to see if we could get some sort of insight into what we might expect. Because at this stage, not giving the story away, we are looking at what the British government have stipulated as what these roads are to be like. And we know £900 has been paid, so something very substantial we're anticipating. Alistair comes back and he says, there's your results. This is my interpretation. It's all clay, some stone, but not much. And we thought, right, okay, well, where's our deck gone? Where's the deck for the road gone? Surely that would have picked up on his GPS, his GPR. But we parked that, done our survey, he's identified that there is clay there and that there's some rocks. And we then hand over to Siobhan McDermott, who is and was at that time our geo-archaeologist. She would have done a lot of stuff with GIS, and she did a cartographic analysis for us, which was great. And she was able to look at the first edition map of the 1830s, and she was able to take later map, as was shown on the map, and drape that on and show the path of the line as it was laid out in the 1840s, whenever the field work was being done during the relief scheme. The thing to note here is Boho Road, because Boho Road is still there and it's still used today. That is the main road. We can only assume that Boho Road is fairly hilly, up, down, over the drumlins. This new road, this lower road that they were planning in 1846 was to be a more direct, low road that would have really good drainage ditches, and they would need it for this area. Boho was always getting flooded. That this was an improvement on the old hilly road. And there is your second edition map. And what's interesting, it's like the maps that Gabby did for Belcoo, you can actually see that even though the road was not finished, they marked it on. Now that's been accentuated by Siobhan with the dots, but they had marked on the existence of the road in the 1860 map. And in the 1950s, still parts of the road are visible. You can see there in the center of the slide with the big red arrows pointing. there's two parallel lines. Those two parallel lines are a stretch of the road that survives. And the ditches are there and the road deck is there. The rest of the road and the track of the road has been obliterated by and large, except for two parts, especially in Drumacooran. It's been returned to agricultural use, but you still get these areas, these boggy areas where you've got this stretch of the road is in situ. So the next thing we do is we go to the Engaged Research Fund, which is great. It's a seed fund that there's in Queen's that is to help academic staff go out and have, when we use the term engaged research, what Queen's means is basically going out and working with the public, working with people. And this was a scheme that we applied for, and we got the funding to undertake fieldwork, 1 week of fieldwork down at the line, C6. The next important thing, following permission from the landowners, the McLaughlin family, Eileen then put in for her license for an archaeological excavation, because all archaeological excavation in Northern Ireland and indeed in the Republic of Ireland has to be licensed by the government archaeologists in the DFC. And there you have Ken Neal signs it off on the 5th of August, and that is our excavation number AE 21117. So we now have got the permission of the landowners, we have got the excavation license, we have funding, off we go. And you can see here drone footage. We had Ryan Montgomery, one of our students, came down and he had a drone, and it was fantastic because it gave really good views that, you know, you wouldn't, 20 years ago, this would be unthinkable that you'd be able to get aerial views of your excavation. You'd have had to have been getting cherry pickers, or you'd have had to have been hiring in planes, or it would have been an absolute nightmare to do it. Now you can get a drone, and your drone can be used to help record what you're doing. And you can see here the two circled areas on the landscape. The area at the larger red circle, C, that's the surviving section of the line that is in the field belonging to the McLaughlins. And then the smaller red circle, there's also another small section of it at F. Another small section of the line survives there. And you can see the other elements of the story. At A, you have Boho Crossroads. That's the Acres Crossroads that was referred to in the presentation. B is Flush Bridge. And at B, that's the point where Boho Road goes running off from one direction. And then the anticipation was that the line would come off and across the field. Now, it was always anticipated that this would be a community excavation. That's what we do. Over the last 8 years, we've done 25 community excavations involving the local public, the local people in the field work. We're very conscious of that. And that was why we went to the Engaged Research Fund, because we knew we could make this into a really good community project. And what we had was a combination. We're only there for a week, but we had a combination of staff from the CCA, professional field archaeologists, a group of 5 students who came down, and 14 members of the public who participated on the excavation. And 2 of the professional archaeologists that we had were Brian Sloan and Rory O'Boyle. And here you can see the 2 of them recording what we encountered. There's the original field drawing, and there is the section drawing across the trench. We opened the trench right the way across the road. 16 meters by 1 meter. What we found was a clay platform that was about 2 feet thick, and it was 11 feet in width. And it was set on the clay ground surface field. And either of those two government specified roads, the 24-foot road or the 21-foot road, they could have been placed on that footing. This is the coloured version that we produced to make it easier to see what's going on here. The blue is the clay road platform. And the striped bits is a bit down to the bottom to see what was going on at the foundations of the road. What we found was that Alistair was absolutely spot on. There was no deck, there was no stone deck, there was just the clay footings. Its extent had been delineated across the landscape. £900 had been clearly expended by the time the field work had ended on the public work, and the soling enabling works had all been completed, and ditches had been dug on either side of them. But the road was never finished. It's one of these roads that just died. The older Boho Road continued in use as it does to this day. And the other thing that came through in the excavation, it is the only time it has happened to me in 40 years of being involved in field archaeology. We found nothing. We did not get anything, not a button, not a clay pipe, not a piece of pottery, nothing. It's the only excavation we've been on where we found nothing. And that tells a story in itself. There was a community involvement, community project. The community was involved in the field work, but we also thought that it would be nice to have an interdenominational community prayer service to remember all of the people who had worked on that road scheme, Catholic and Protestant, because the famine was not something that affected just Catholics, it affected Protestants because it affected people who were poor. That's what happened. If you were poor, you were in a very bad place during the years of the famine. So we brought a local lady, Sister Adele Bannon, and we got the local Church of Ireland minister, the Reverend Samson Pajuka. And on the evening of Thursday, the 26th of August, we had an open evening and a prayer service to commemorate the events of Black 47. We also had TV cameras out with us, Digging for Britain, which is a BBC production. They came out and they filmed, and you can get it on iPlayer. It's season 9, episode 6, broadcasted in January last year, and we were actually very pleased with it. We were worried about how this would be presented. We were concerned that the nuances of what was going on, they wouldn't pick up on. And we had no editorial control over it. But we were very impressed with what they did. We were also very impressed by Roisin Henderson, one of the journalists in the Fermanagh Herald, who was hugely supportive to what we did. And one of the things that we liked, this is a quote from Roisin that she put into her article. Ask for any prospective students, whether still in school or thinking of returning to education. Those on site in Boho last week were a better advertisement for the profession than any university prospectus. I'm very happy about that. That was a very nice thing for her to write. We did an article, 6-page article in Archaeology Ireland that was published in winter 2021. Tells the story of what we've done. We've wrote up the report. There's a full report, a data structure report, that's been submitted to the Historic Environment Division for lodgement. And the other thing that we did, we received an invite from Dr. Jason Keane, the academic coordinator with the Irish Heritage Trust, to participate in the making of their Mapping Famine Roads video. And we discussed, Eileen and myself discussed the work at Boho in September 20. It was filmed in August 2022, and then it was put online in September 2022, end of September. But probably the most significant thing that we did, we got Historic Environment Division, DFC, inspectors to include the road as a site and monument. It is now on the Northern Ireland Sites and Monuments record. It has got its own number, and it is the first Famine Road to be given that designation. So we're pretty pleased about that. So just to conclude, I mean, there's so many people involved in this project. You'll have picked up on that as it went along. It was a short project. We got wonderful weather for it. It was probably one of the best excavations I was ever on. We had the local community, the landowners, we had local historians, the likes of Margaret Gallagher, me and McLaughlin. We had all our chums from Queen's. We had our volunteers. We had the service been led by the Sister Adele and Father Seamus and Reverend Sampson. Andrew Houston, the police constable, came out from the neighbourhood policing team in Enniskillen and looked after all the traffic for the open evening. And Roisin Henderson, who really did give us great coverage in the Fermanagh Herald. So that's me, and that is the line. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colm. Do you want to maybe stop your presentation there? That's possible.
Yeah, I can.
If it's possible, maybe. Just to go back to my earlier question about £900, myself and someone else did a wee bit of Googling, and in 1840, from the National Archives website, .gov.uk, in 1840, £900 would equate to about just over £54,000 today. And I put in the same figure for 1850, and it equates to nearly 72,000. So obviously, there was very high inflation over that 10-year period. So that was just interesting to answer my query earlier. And I know we'll have a few comments and questions coming in, but I just want to ask, in relation to why there was a lot of subdivision by the cottiers, is there any specific explanations there? Am I right in saying that maybe they weren't able to just leave their land to one child? Am I correct there? Is there something there that was almost forced division?
I think there is an element to that there. I think what you've got is, if you look at what's happened in the 18th century in England, from 1750 onwards, you have a movement from the land because it's the era of industrialization. And you have people leaving the village, going into the towns because there's lots of work in these new factories and foundries. Okay, places like, you know, in around Birmingham, in the Midlands, the Black Country, that any of you have been to Coalbridge, that sort of place. So you've got this growth in urban populations and the work in these urban populations and that grow up around the factories. We see it in Belfast. I mean, Belfast, 1800, there's what, 10,000 people in Belfast. By 1900, there's what, 390,000 people in Belfast. So it sucks people in because there's work. If you've got a situation which was the case in Ireland, it's this rural subsistence economy, and there isn't anything else, and you're too poor to actually leave, and you don't really want to leave, and you've got potatoes, and you can make a living. It's rough, but you can make a living, and you can, you know, grow enough potatoes on your quarter acre. You stay and you do your work, and you do the work for the landlord, and you grow your potatoes, and you keep a pig, and the pig is sold off or slaughtered, and that means that you get the money to pay the rent, and things tick on. That's my understanding of where we're at. And the population across Europe has grown at this time as well. So it's not just Ireland has got a great population. What is interesting is whenever you actually look, England and Ireland had exactly the same, well, not exactly the same, but they had roughly the same population size in the 1840s, 8 million. And you look at what happens to Ireland, and you look at what happens to England, and how England's population increases. And we're just about, I think we're now at 7 million people living on the island of Ireland. We're just about back to where we were in the 1840s. In England,
and since the famine, up until very recently, there was serious immigration continuing out of the country.
That's it.
Economically, the serious immigration. You know, it was only really, could I say, maybe up until the realistically 90s, it started to slow down a bit. Even in the 80s, you know.
It's one of those things that the diversification of the Irish economy, in particular, the Irish economy, we're sort of insulated because we're in the United Kingdom, but up until 1973, Ireland, even though it had gained its, the Free State, 26 county Free State, which became the Republic, its economy still functioned the way it did before partition. Its economy still was agricultural by and large, and it was all about feeding England. Joining the EEC changed that. And what you got then was diversification in the Irish economy. And that has led to a change in states for Ireland.
Yeah.
And wealth.
Very much so.
Because they're now a modern European country. And there was always that drag factor. There was never, Ireland could never get away from being a food basket. Talking about the 26 counties, could never get away from being a food basket for England. The EEC and the EU changed that.
There was just a comment here that, for example, in South Armagh, North Louth, as it's very good roads, instead mountain walls were built, at least 50 kilometers of mountain walls going like really up the sides of mountains. Like crazy stuff.
Yeah, there's actually in that map on roads, a map on the Famine Roads. There's a section, short section in it, which is about the walls that were being built in Armagh. So yeah, there's none of these public schemes could be seen to benefit anybody. Individual, no landlord. Had to be that this was something that would be for the public good. Well, what are you going to build? Roads. Let's do roads. That's for the public good, even though you've got a pretty good road. And you can see that, especially whenever it always amazed me what Gabby's work in Belcoo, that map that I showed. If you look at it, it's got a wonderful road network, and yet they're building roads in the middle of nowhere, and the roads are never finished. But it's clear they needed to do something. They needed to have some sort of relief scheme in that area. What are we going to do? We'll build another road. It's crazy stuff.
You mentioned, and again, like you mentioned, even the working conditions from 6 a.m. in the morning to 6 p.m. Crazy hours for people who are starved as it was and everything.
In the
middle of winter, with no adequate clothing or nothing, barefooted in every context.
Absolutely.
When we look at it from our modern day eyes of expectations, it's crazy stuff. Just someone has asked here, there's a lot of positive feedback and people have really enjoyed your talk, but someone was asked here.
That's good. Really bored. You'd be thinking that, why do you just get that from the archaeologist? He doesn't.
Jared hasn't had a word in yet, so you've done really well. But someone has asked here, you've mentioned a few big books in your presentation, but is there one particular that you could suggest as being as the best, maybe entry-level book to read on this subject? Is there anything particular?
I think probably if you can get hold of it, Unearthing Hidden Ireland, Chuck Orser's book, on the work that he did in Roscommon. I think that's the best. Now, it's academic. It's not, it's not general reader. It is an academic book, but it is a very good introduction to what he did in Roscommon. In general, if you're looking for an introduction to historical archaeology, what is historical archaeology? I would also recommend Chuck's book, but don't go for the 3rd edition, the one that was published in 2016, because it's published, it's now taken over and it's been published by Routledge, and the paperback is selling at £100. Go for the 1st edition or the 2nd edition. You get it for about a tenner.
Right. Okay. And I'll share that information in a later email with everybody.
It's very simple, and it's aimed at students, and it explains what is a historical archaeologist.
Jared, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, first of all, I thought it was a fascinating talk, and it would have been amazing to have actually been there. And it's just, I think when you're a historian, what Colm does is the equivalent, I suppose, of me going into an archive, and sometimes you just sit back and handle a document and think you're maybe the first person in 200 years who's laid hands on this letter, and you think about the person who wrote it and the conditions they were writing, and whether it's something from the 1700s, 1800s, even the 1916 period. I remember handling Parrot Pierce's last letter to his mother before he was executed over in the English National Archives in Kew, and I had to go into a special room, and somebody was supervising me. I had to wear white gloves, and it gives you tingles down your back. There's no two ways about it. First thing, the statistics for children down in the workhouses, I think it was the Kilkenny one, about 2/3 or so were under 6 years of age, and that would fit in with certainly what I've done. Seems to be right across the country. In Lisburn, I've done statistical analysis on that, Lurgan, Armagh, and very much the case that the majority of deaths were those. Well, in the workhouse, they usually had the 40 Guardians Minute books. It was under 5 or under 2, but certainly it would be in and around 2/3. In terms of the public works, I mean, that caused huge controversy. I made reference to it there a couple of weeks ago in one of the talks I gave, and that there were vested interests because the roads were seen as the easy option. Just go and build roads, as Colm said, roads going to nowhere. It was mad. But you also had a huge demand for drainage works, for what were termed reproductive works that would be of some benefit, usually benefits to landlords, because you'd be reclaiming land which could then be rented out. And so you had meetings which became violent. I think I made reference to the fact there was one in South Armagh where the courthouse extraordinary presenting sessions was held, and the courthouse was so full that the gallery collapsed. I think it was in Park Hill. There were so many people in it because you had landlords agents in. You had various interests vying for the money that was going to be requested to either go towards roads or go towards reproductive drainage works. But I thought it was, when I was doing my thesis on the Great Hunger in County Armagh, you often came across reference to it being the coldest winter in years, and I thought it would be interesting to actually put some meat on those bones, that statement. So eventually I found that the Armagh Observatory has daily weather records from the 1700s. And I'll just read here, if you don't mind. It's just a paragraph, just basically, as I say, put meat on these bones. This is from my unpublished thesis on the Great Hunger in Armagh, probably never be published. But in the middle of December 1846, the Cady Relief Committee reported greater distress since the severe weather set in. While some days later, the Tynan and Middletown Committee lamented how destitution is greatly aggravated since the winter set in with such severity. Indeed, from November to April, daily temperatures fell below freezing on 42 occasions, including 15 days in December 1846 and 14 in February 1847. Further analysis illustrates there were a series of cold snaps during which the temperature remained below freezing for a number of days in succession. The first of these was from the 27th of November to the 4th of December, with another lasting a week from the 10th to the 17th of December. The freezing temperatures returned on the 6th of February for a period of 1 week, and again from the 24th of February to the 2nd of March. The final cold snap illustrated the longevity of the harsh winter, and that it occurred on the 20th of March and lasted until the 3rd of April. While temperatures such as -5 must have proved excruciating for those put to work on the roads, the difficulty was exacerbated by regular snowfalls throughout this period. Beginning with 1 day of snow in November, there occurred a further 2 days fall in December, January, and March, while in February there were 3 separate snowfalls. In addition, the Armagh Observatory reported ice all over the roof on the 29th of January, while on the 1st of April, there were a series of hail showers throughout the day. The difficulties resulting from such conditions were acknowledged by one of the government's relief officials, who commented on the 9th of February, "We have had a heavy fall of snow, which will cause much suffering." The winter also witnessed a number of severe gales, which further impinged on those employed on the public works. Thus, from October to March, there were 32 recorded gales, the largest monthly figures being 11 in November, the further 8 in October and January. In the midst of such conditions, Reverend Edward Disney, while remarking that many on such works were severely injured by cold and want of sufficient food, revealed the inevitable consequences for the population of Newtown Hamilton. Many of the labourers and many small farmers have pawned all their clothes and been obliged to work on the roads in this inclement weather with scanty covering. Their health and strength are failing fast. And I think that what you said, Colm, was very interesting. That was the only dig that you'd never found anything, because the people had absolutely nothing. And you find that in the pawn shop returns for the time, there's a huge increase in the number of items being lodged in the pawn shops in 1847 and 48, but the value is very, very small compared to what would have been in 1844, 45. They pawned everything, and the line was used by clergymen. Families have pawned absolutely everything, including the family Bible. So perhaps it's no surprise that there was nothing to be found there, because the people had absolutely not. But I think that information from the Armagh Observatory actually, adds to what you're doing there. That when you're standing watching that, the people were working in minus temperatures for throughout October to April, and it was a long winter. It lasted until early April when you had snow and ice.
Yeah.
Colm, this is a question for you, but Jared, you may be able to add to this answer as well. Have you any idea of what population of non-cottiers died in the famine? Or maybe you mentioned roughly what even population were cottiers, and do you have any idea the non-cottiers then?
Well, half the population of Ireland, so 8 million, half the population is cottiers.
Okay.
Probably would know better from his research, his historical research, than me. But from my reading of the situation, it tends to be the lowest, the cottier class who take the hammer. People who can get out. Some farmers get out and they emigrate, but it's the cottiers are the ones that can't get out, and they're the ones that are in abject poverty, and they're the ones that end up in the workhouse getting typhus, tuberculosis. They're the ones that are being killed, and they're the class that are gone in the aftermath of the famine. You talk about there's accounts after the famine that the countryside's dead. Countryside's dead because even the birds, the hares, the foxes, everything has been eaten. So the wildlife has taken a hammer, but there's a lack of people in the countryside, and there's no singing, there's no music, there's nothing. It's just there's a grimness descends on Ireland in the aftermath. I don't know, Jared, you may have more insight on the historical.
Well, it's actually there. What the Colm said, it's interesting to say about silence, because that was remarked upon, and actually they said there was no barking of dogs, which is says an awful lot as well. People had actually resorted to eating dogs. Yes, with the cottier population, of course, they would have been the Irish-speaking population. So with their demise, the Irish language then died as well. It was basically wiped out. National system of education had been introduced by the British government in 1831, which stipulated that all education was to be through the means of English, through the medium of English, and that Irish was not to be taught. So there was a generation had emerged by 1846 which hadn't spoken Irish, but the Irish-speaking population, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and older, they were wiped out by the famine.
How can we, I know this may have been mentioned before in other lectures, but how can we access the 1841 and 1851 census? Jared?
It's online.
Or Colm? It's online, just general Google search to come across. Okay.
Yeah, you'll find that British parliamentary papers, but they're online.
Okay, the British Parliamentary Papers. Okay, thank you. So Lurgan, the new line in Lurgan comes from the Famine Works
I don't know
release.
about that. I don't know
We
about
don't-
that. I mean, and I don't want to contradict somebody. I saw that
Yeah,
coming in.
because it is it.
The new
Yeah.
line is a common term. It's used in towns all over the place, and I know the new line in Lurgan, and it is fairly close to the site of where the workhouse would have been. But I couldn't be sure.
Okay.
And it's wrong. I didn't come across that in the contemporary evidence of roads that were built. A lot of also, as well as roads being built, there was a lot of filling in of hollows and lowering of hills. And Colm had made mention that the Boho Road may have been up and down and very hilly. So, the amount of work that went in, extremely strenuous work, certainly by today's standards. And it was, so they lowered hills and filled in hollows to create the straighter roads and all that. But I didn't come across that one in the new line in Lurgan.
Okay. Now, I think this is something a lot of us probably have thought about on numerous occasions. But if the potato crop in the 1840s hadn't failed, what do you think would have happened in Ireland? Because certainly population size for the size of the country and all. But in saying that, I suppose it's like if we're going into the unknown there, there's still, there could have been a health epidemic at some stage or something, which could have annihilated a lot of the population. We just really don't know.
Well, the first thing is, you could give a trite answer and say if the potato crop in the 1840s had not failed, what do you think would have happened in Ireland? The potato crop in the 1850s would have failed, or the potato crop in the 1860s would have failed. What you've got is, until you get to the end of the century and you've got bluestone being used as a means to prevent the blight, you've got a society which is teetering on the brink. And you've got a big population and they're reliant on one foodstuff, and that's not good. So it's very possible that there's some sort of catastrophic event could have happened. I think, and this is just my own opinion, I think that the British government and their response could have been different. We've seen that, we've talked about it, the ridiculous situation where you've got people being put out onto road schemes. Maybe you would have had a better informed government who weren't taking the lead from a character like Trevelyan. Maybe there would have been better efforts to try and prevent the catastrophe. But I think Ireland probably did need to have reform. The land holdings were too small. The levels of poverty were too small. You would have needed to have some form of industrialization, or you would have needed to have had some sort of organized immigration to places like Australia. There would have had to have been something, because whenever the famine, when it lifts, Irish society changes, it becomes grimmer. But you have all of these small farms are being done away with, and you have the great, the squaring, as it's called. All these small holdings are being put together into farms, and the houses change. And, we've got this view of our traditional cottages as being sort of like, time immemorial. These are the houses of the Irish. They're not. They're actually, a lot of those houses, those cottages that we have, the thatched cottages, they actually belong after the famine. And it's sort of, you get, I think anyway, you get a change in Ireland. It's still an agricultural economy, but it's not subsistence agriculture. And of course, then as that moves on, you then have the agitation leading to the Land Acts and the fact that landlords eventually lose their land. That's a bit rambling, but I mean, it's
no,
just,
but yes, but true, very
yes. Where would Ireland have gone? I don't think it would have been rosy in the garden.
No, yeah.
I think that it would have, something would have happened. It would have moved.
Change was needed.
Change was needed.
Yes. Yeah. George, have you anything to add there?
I think is interesting, perhaps in terms of the political consequences. You know, if you had the same population, if you look at what was happening in relation to voting rights were being extended. 1852, they were widened, so you had more of the population being brought into the voting sphere. So if there hadn't been the decline of 1840s, you may well have seen a push for home rule way before it actually happened, you know, which is, again, it's like, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I've done work on this, but the extension of the franchise, which saw the first home rule act, first attempt at home rule in 1886, may well have happened earlier. Daniel O'Connell died in 1847. It's counterfactual history. It's, you know, what would have happened if, well, you know, all you can do is surmise, and then people criticize you for coming out with something, but you're trying to base it on what you maybe studied or read, or, you know, so it is difficult. But certainly politically, it's a bit like, you know, something I'm interested in would be the reckons of the 1795-96 period, where Catholics from down Armagh and South Derry were driven west. And recently, archaeological research has shown one of their campsites in Galway, where they camped in 1796. And that was thousands and thousands of people, maybe 10, 15,000, the largest migrations inland in Ireland. And, you know, again, counterfactual history, if they hadn't moved, then would partition have happened 130 years later, because the population of nationalists as it became in that area, those areas would have been much greater. So, you know, it's things you can sort of surmise, but you're basing it on what you've read and studied, you know. So I think if you hadn't had that, and, you know, it's worth remembering that in 1879, what was referred to as An Gorta Beag actually happened, the smaller famine, and that was very intense, especially in the west, from Donegal right through areas like Leitrim, Fermanagh, etc. It hit Ulster bad in the west, but that 1879 famine was very, very harsh, and it was also great poverty, especially in the west and south, in Connacht and Munster, and obviously Donegal always falls into that bracket. And when the Congestic Districts Board was established in the 1890s, severe poverty there.
Colm, your work you've been involved in, has similar work been carried out in other counties? Someone here actually listening is interested in relation to County Kerry. And I know I've come across snippets of mentioning of work elsewhere, but are there any particular projects that have happened?
As far as I'm aware, ours is the first and only archaeological excavation on a Famine Road.
Okay.
That's not to say that there aren't people who are studying the Famine Roads elsewhere in Ireland. And that video that we took part in, it reports from across the island, people who have been working on the Famine Roads and building up the stories of those Famine Roads in those areas, from Cork to County Clare. But we're the only one where there's actually been an excavation.
Next question, Jared. Well, actually, sorry, Colm, this will be for you too. Is there an estimate of the capital allocation by the British government during the famine period for famine relief works in total?
I'm really glad you asked that, because it's one that I was just about to ask Jared.
Well, actually, I haven't got that figure, but yes, I mean, you would have an overall figure of the amount that would have been presented through the event, extraordinary presentment sections. So yes, that figure will exist, and that would be in British parliamentary papers. As Colm said, Victorians were amazing with the amount of detail they produced in volumes. And I mean, I think it was Southampton University have digitized a huge amount of what were called the blue books, the British parliamentary papers, on amazing range of subjects. So yes, you would have an overall figure for that. And actually, when you look at the British papers in London, for example, and they've got, you know, taxation records under various headings, there's a huge amount of information there on the efforts to, you know, bring in food from America and elsewhere, and there's copious amounts of evidence there. So yes, undoubtedly it would be figures by probably the way it would by county, by barony, by province, and then by the country as a whole. So yes, that figure would exist. Yeah.
Thanks, Jared. Colm, who supervised the work parties on these schemes, and where would they've come from? Would they've come from in the local community?
Hierarchy there was a hierarchy, and that's the great thing about Smith's book, is actually goes into it in detail. Who does what, who's responsible for what. So you have basically the county surveyor is responsible for setting out the line of the road. And then you have a civil engineer and a conducting engineer, which was Smith, that was his job. And each of these, each county, each area would have had their own conducting engineer, and they just basically wrote about and made sure that everything was going on according to plan with the civil engineering aspects of the road work. But then you had people, you had clerks who were responsible for making sure that the road book was kept and who was there and who was getting what and paying out the money. And you had the gangers, the guys who actually were responsible for overseeing the work and making sure that the work actually got done. So you had a hierarchy. Where did they come from? Well, Smith, as I said, is the way he describes himself is a bit weird. I think he's Anglo-Irish. He might be English, but he says his parents are English, but he's by birth Irish. He certainly comes across to Ireland to help out. But some of it would be local people. It would be the guys who were employed prior to the famine, such as the county surveyor. Well, they may have come from England, they may have come from Scotland, they may be from that particular area in Ireland, they may have come from Dublin. They were responsible as part of their job as a county surveyor. They were responsible to take on the work associated with the roads. The gangers, local guys, and the labourers, local guys.
Thank you. Marcin makes a comment here that probably in the Broadlands archives at Southampton University. I'm not sure what he's referring to. Could that be to the previous question? We're looking at.
It's the British Parliamentary Papers. Well, they've been digitized. They're online, so it was through. It was under other offices of Southampton University.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And actually, someone has sent a link, put a link in here in the chat to those as well. And maybe the final question is, is there any location where we might be able to find the names of those that were in the workhouses? That would be a case by case basis according to each workhouse, wouldn't it, Jared?
It's the admission registers. 130 workhouses in 1845. Of those 130, 17 still have the admission registers. Of those 17, 12 are in Ulster. So, I mean, the admission register. Now, there may be some with gaps, but generally there's a run from when they first opened, 1841 to right through, and you get as it did call out the names earlier, the name, gender, age, occupation, condition when they enter the workhouse, who they came in with, when they arrived, when they left.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. That was a fantastic talk tonight. Colm, the feedback's been wonderful. People have really enjoyed it and it's been very informative. We suppose it helped. There was no pressure running into another talk, so it was able to flow nicely too. And thank you greatly. I just want to mention to everyone that next week, for week 5 of our lecture series, our guest speakers are Professor Mark McGowan from the University of Toronto. His topic will be famine migration to British North America. And will also be then Dr. Damien Shields, Research Fellow at Northumbria University. His title will be Voices from the American Civil War, the Stories of Irish Famine Era Immigrants and the Conflict that Changed Their Lives. So hopefully everyone can join us again next week. I appreciate you all joining us. And again, Colm, Jared, thank you both very much for contributing.